Welcome to the Will to Power podcast. This is a special episode. So, this is talking points against the far left. This so much isn't things that will convince people on the far left to give up their ideology, but there are things that will demoralize them and that will convince people on the fence and help sway public opinion against them. So these are all crafted to really cut at the heart of left-wing ideology, and it gets around a lot of the common arguments. Like if you see online, it's usually like, oh, Holodomor, like repressive Stalinism, that sort of thing, which doesn't really convince that many people at all because it's such a common sort of argument and it's so easily dismissed, and it really has no effect, I guess, is the grand point. But these are all things that really cut at the heart of leftism and expose it and really make it very difficult for leftists to get around. Like I said, it's more designed to demoralize them, demoralize the left, while exposing them for what they are to the middle ground and souring public opinion against them. So I think there's like 11 or 12, but let's get right into it. The first one is that leftist morality is completely, I'm going to read this. I'm going to do a combination of like reading an introduction and then kind of going ad lib. But so leftist morality is often empty. It's basically based on opinions, repeated popular narratives, and abstractions. So this is contrasted to traditional Asian morality, such as Confucianism, which prioritizes a proper fulfillment of prescribed roles, or on the other hand, traditional Western virtue ethics, which emphasizes conduct, habit, and character guided by specific virtues seen as adaptive according to natural law. So what this means is that leftist morality, it's really cheap, is what it is. It's, I'm virtue signaling online, I have this public opinion, okay, I'm repeating the narrative, that makes me a good person, when in reality that's such a low bar that it creates a kind of a shitty sheep-like society. And the people who think that way, they're often personally kind of manipulative. Like, it doesn't, just because somebody like publicly ascribes to this like Black Lives Matter, feminism narrative, they can still be very manipulative, predatory people while using that as a shield. And that's often the case. You don't really see it from the outside, but within the left itself, it's not unusual for there to be some pretty shady inner workings going on. I will just say that, like, the leftist morality isn't morality at all. It's kind of cheap talk. And they pretend like that's the only bar of value, of moral value, when in reality, every society that's been successful has had a sort of virtue-based, or at least behavioral, role-based ethics. Something that's a little bit more substantive, a little bit more grounded. All right, so the next talking point against the far left, and whenever I say the far left, I'm talking about people who either prescribe to this kind of like extreme egalitarianism or like kind of equity focus on one hand, and a little bit more, I'll get more into like kind of Marxist economics and things like that. So the next one is that leftists are hypocrites who, despite claiming to be against the system and capitalism, actively ignore or even encourage the growing power of corporations to take retaliatory and ideological-driven campaigns to censor or suppress private individuals, who are usually virtual nobodies. Likewise, leftists are often the first to adopt intrusive, capital-intensive technological modifications to their daily routines, such as using a smartwatch, ordering from an online retailer, or intermediary food delivery service like Uber Eats, and often prefer white-collar, technical, or institutional work as opposed to blue-collar, manual labor, or construction services. So again, like this kind of goes into the shallowness of the left, right? On one hand, they'll claim to be against the powers that be in capitalism. On the other hand, they don't really mind, or they'll even cheerlead when someone gets canceled by these powers, which I mean, the implication there is that you support the growing power of those corporations to take retaliatory or politically motivated sanctions against private individuals. So it's just weird on one hand that leftists and anti-capitalists, quote unquote, will nonetheless basically shill for mega corporations, big tech, things like that. And then on the other hand, within their personal lives, again, like I already mentioned how they're kind of shady individuals, but they'll also be the first to kind of rely on capital services, as I'll probably talk about a little bit later. And as I've talked about elsewhere, we're moving towards a system where increasing aspects of our lives are being monetized, are being, repackaged to us as a commodity. You didn't used to have to buy water. You don't remember that? I mean, a lot of people don't, right? That's the thing. A lot of people don't remember that. But there was a time when bottled water was not a thing. And now you have things like, Hulu and Netflix and Strava Plus and all those things. But the point being is that the people on the far left usually will buy into that, right? Not all of them. You do have the kind of crusty ones, but the kind of middle class pretensions sort of person, they're not opposed to getting Spotify Plus. It's another kind of aspect of hypocrisy, and they'll be like, well, my personal choices aren't going to change anything. But again, what are you but your personal choices? Right? That would be the kind of virtue ethicist response to that. So moving on, point number 3, talking point against the left. Leftist ideology is personally maladaptive. It's a failed life strategy. It's also a failed sexual strategy for men. It's kind of based on youthful altruism at first, but it often develops into resentment and a bitter spirit. Okay, so there's a lot there. So basically this states that, holding on to this leftist ideology, it's a poor mindset. It won't lead you anywhere well. If you think that the world is stacked against you and that it's this gigantic battle between evil, successful people and, the virtuous poor, well, guess what? You're probably going to end up poor and you're probably not going to change anything. It's just not a good personal philosophy. It doesn't translate well into a personal philosophy, I should say. It usually produces kind of mediocre or anxiety-ridden people. And I guess that's a question of which way the causal relationship goes. Because I might question that later. Is it that anxiety-ridden kind of stunted people ascribe to leftist ideology, or do leftist ideologies create stunted people? I would say both. I would say leftist ideology is like I said, it's a poor mindset to have. That notion that you're, if you envision yourself as oppressed, well, guess what? You've oppressed yourself. You're holding yourself down because you're limiting your horizons in your head before you can even take action. There's this part of your brain called the reticular activating device, or a reticular activating system. And basically what it is you see what you look for. You can do this now, right? If you are to do me a favor and scan the room and look for everything that is green. Okay, so if you look around, you're looking for everything that's green, you got it in your head. Now close your eyes and say what is green. There's probably a few things. You can probably name them pretty easily. But now if you try to do the same thing with red or maybe black, it's going to be very difficult for you because you weren't looking for that. So it's the same thing. When you're looking for oppression all around you, you're going to see it. And it's going to suck for you because it's going to drive you crazy, for one thing. You're probably not going to change it. And it's just going to sap your mental energy and your vital energy. It's going to go into these kind of negative places, this kind of bitterness. For men as well, it can be a failed sexual strategy. It's kind of like the pick-me boy thing, where it's you have these guys who. This one's pretty complicated as well because there's so much lies told to men by feminism about how they respond, or even women, right? Women don't really understand their own psychology. They in the moment know what they're feeling, but there's that gulf between what they say they want and what they do oftentimes. And that's true with everybody, and that's part of behavioral psychology, right? There's a thing, I should let the leftists know this, that there's this thing called behavioral psychology that studies that very aspect of psychology, that gulf between what people say they want and what they actually do. Like, we all say we want good things, we all say we want to be better, we actually do different things. But in any case, you want an ideology that promotes good things in your life, and leftist ideology simply isn't that. So it's a failed life strategy. And with the failed sexual strategy thing, you get these guys who will praise feminism, take up these causes as a way to look cool or fashionable, or in some cases, whenever you get these kind of, I'd say like ideological sects, SECTS, these groupings, these divisions, these institutions of leftist ideology thought. Leftists aren't necessarily a monolith to the extreme. They're pretty divided in their stupid little ideologies about Trotsky and Stalin and blah blah blah, about history. It's a big old history fucking society for some of them. But in any case, when you get these kind of institutions, these little groupings, the people at the top naturally command a little bit of social status within that. So they can turn that towards leveraging SMV, essentially, sexual market value, within that group at least. So it's pretty easy for like the leader of an activist group to get laid, quite honestly. And again, some guys will just make a public display of it to try to present themselves as a nice guy. As guys who get laid a lot know, being a nice guy doesn't work. And as nice guys should know that being a leftist doesn't really work. And this is actually interesting. This is actually how I got out of left-wing ideology, or one of the ways. I wanted to get laid more. And initially, whenever I stumbled onto some aspects of the pickup community, I was like, wow, this is really fucking extreme, man. I don't know. Like, I don't know if I can get down with that. But, I gradually realized that there's a winning strategy and then there's an ideologically charged failed strategy. And the latter is really what left-wing politics is. So it's something to consider. Like, after I dropped the left-wing ideology, the pretensions, and actually learned how people operated according to reality, not according to my wishful thinking, then I was much more successful in that regard, certainly. I didn't touch politics for years, quite honestly. I spent all my time like chasing, well, I don't want to say chasing, but going after extremely hot women and having a decent amount of success at it. But in any case, a lot of left-wing ideology starts as youthful altruism. So it starts from a good place, right? It's these kids who want the best thing for the world. I got into left-wing politics out of environmentalism. And this is a long time ago. But it eventually leads to a kind of resentment, right? It leads to a resentment towards those you don't understand, those who you see as benefiting or causing the problems. And again, it leads to a sort of bitter spirit that wears on you. And leftists don't often like to acknowledge the kind of deeper esoteric or spiritual truths, but the way you characterize the world, it kind of wears on your body. It wears on the energy you hold in you. It can really change you if you hold on to it for too long. And leftists have on one hand, a kind of resentful, sometimes bitter spirit, and also a somewhat arrogant spirit. I will say that. But the other thing I would say is, so as far as like leftist ideology is personally maladaptive, in terms of it leads to bad outcomes. It actually leads to it's correlated with more mental illness, especially with women. So that's I'm not gonna link that. You can look that up yourself. Politics, mental illness. Google it. But so there's that. It does fuck up your life. It's like smoking crack, right? Leftist ideology, if you get addicted to it, it's part of that rage, righteous indignation sort of emotion, and it becomes addictive in a lot of ways. But it doesn't help you over the long run, right? It really kind of fucks you up unless you manage to make it to the top of some, woke virtue signaling corporate pyramid scheme, then you're not really going to get a lot out of it. On the other hand, I'll mention this elsewhere, but I think physical fitness I think right-wing ideology is ultimately adaptive, right? It helps you. It's personally adaptive. And part of that is physical fitness, right? Physical fitness is very self-responsibility oriented. You can't redistribute physical fitness. The person who goes to the gym or the person who does the exercise, if they do it consistently, they get the gains. You can't take it away from them. You can force them to sit in a box and they'll lose it eventually, but you can't give it to someone else. And that's one reason why physical fitness is attractive, because it signifies a little bit of status, also health. But that's one reason that leftists kind of hate it in some regards. They have a little bit of spite towards the physically fit and towards the beautiful, is because on one hand they can't redistribute it. It's kind of like a value scale they can't touch. And then on the other hand, their own ideology kind of distorts both of those and dissuades to some degree people of those ideologies from becoming physically fit, becoming actually beautiful, as opposed to a sight, I suppose would be the best word for it. And this is a good time to mention that there's this really interesting esoteric notion that people don't have ideas, but rather ideas have people, right? So it's not so much that this idea is yours, but rather this idea that is popular in society or available in society can take you, and it can kind of push you in different directions, and it might not be good, right? You want to be embraced by the ideologies and the emotions that will push you into a good place. And again, left-wing ideology is often not that. It's kind of the expression of a resentful, bitter spirit who started out as hopeful and idealistic. So there's that to consider. The next good point, the fourth talking point against left-wing ideology, is that great societies aren't built and maintained by leftist morality. Instead, leftist morality is both a symptom and a cause of the degeneration of great societies. In that sense, leftist ideologies are socially maladaptive. And this is why countries such as the USSR, China, and other socialist countries typically, or at least eventually, adopted more pragmatic forms of governments and economic management which are far to the right of the ideals of today's Western far leftists. So there's a lot there again. So there's the notion that this kind of fake leftist morality, it doesn't, not only is it personally maladaptive, it's socially maladaptive, right? This fetishization of equality, this fetishization of human rights, it doesn't necessarily spawn a great society. There's kind of like this logical leap that a lot of like Marxists, for example, will take. It's like, well, if you free people from class society and free people from exploitation, then they'll, or anarchists will say it too, if you free people from hierarchy, they'll naturally do great things, which is not necessarily the case. There's A and then B is a question mark and then C. So yeah, there's that. But again, I'd also say that these leftist moralities, they're more a symptom and a cause of the degeneration of a great society. If you actually look at the history of decolonization, for example, the British Empire, the Portuguese Empire, the Spanish Empire, things like that, it really followed a left-wing spirit that developed within these societies. I know far leftists like to shit on George Orwell, but he was pretty into human rights at the time, and he was pretty far left by the standard of the time, at least with England, right? And he was really part of that cultural voice that was calling for the relinquishment of the British Empire before it happened. So I would say that, obviously, like we're far gone from the days of the Western empires, right? This isn't 1965 even, whenever it's kind of crumbling. But it's only at advanced stages of a society that these kind of woke, pause, social justice notions even become part of the discourse. And this is so much so that in order to have a functioning society, countries which often start off with leftist pretenses, like the USSR and China, adopt these more pragmatic forms of governments. Like I said, a kind of rightist socialism, compared to at least what far leftists want to see. So it's interesting to note that, and I would say again, like, peoples like in history, right? The Chinese Empire, the Greeks, the Romans, the Mongols, they all had a kind of an adaptive morality, right? Adaptive ideologies, adaptive moralities that placed a premium on those virtues, on those individual actions and habits that, when combined in a social organism, produced a great civilization. And because these sorts of virtues aren't really part of leftist ideology, not in any functional or significant sense, you don't actually see anything great produced out of leftism. And I'll come back to that later. So the next part is that leftists often and this is a long one, I gotta read from this. So leftists often misidentify the problem. For example, clamoring for universal health care instead of a culture and physical infrastructure of a society which prioritizes health in a general sense, i.e. something like general gym membership, or universal gym membership, socialized gym membership. That would prevent a lot more sickness and disease than, simply giving people statins or whatever. But again, that's a little bit too far-sighted for some people. In any case, in addition, they often think in these kind of like sweeping categorizations, often ones which don't correspond to reality. In far-left Marxist rhetoric, the primary class division is seen as being between the working class and capital. However, there are so many exceptions and reality-based qualifications to this that it's effectively meaningless. And I'm going to give some examples of this right now. I have this in asterisks, but things like OnlyFans girls and cryptocurrency traders and online marketers and real estate agents and digital nomads, these all kind of exist outside of traditional worker bourgeoisie paradigm. More or less, moreover, anyone with a 401k or any stock at all is a capital owner. There's a lot of blurred lines here. And then conversely, there is actual true poverty, wretchedness, and apparent kind of wage slavery in many industries, but they're in the global south. And these are industries which the working conditions are unimaginable in many parts of the first world, and kind of unimaginable in the capital cities of these countries themselves oftentimes. But even this doesn't justify a kind of static structural dichotomy of first and third world. So that's just kind of showing how the common analytical framework of Marxists is not really up to date, and it's so kind of, again, a dichotomy that it's hard for it to be anything but a simple narrative. But back to what I was saying, the left is always backwards looking and eager to bring up select historical context to describe the relevance and validity of their grievances. Yet they fail to zoom out further and understand that the history of the world is one of civilization-wide competition with the occasional burst of creative, conquering, Apollonian spirit, such that was represented by Britain, Greece, Rome, Mongolia under Genghis Khan, etc. These were societies that moved history forward through innovation and conquest. The United States was merely the last historical example. So thus, it makes absolutely no sense to condemn an individual, particularly in American history, or anyone really, because they succeeded by the dominant values and mores of their time. Rather, it makes much more sense to learn from them, something that leftists find hard to comprehend. Even if we don't think their actions are a positive prescription, that is to say, something we should do today. While pontification on misconceived understandings of class and social issues, they also fail to identify the core kind of political, financial, and technical class, that is to say, the modern oligarchy, that is kind of running stuff today, at the top today. Instead, it prattles on about whiteness and capitalism. Okay, so let's see. So yeah, just basically describing how leftists really don't understand the world, essentially. They kind of have these really simple dichotomies, these really simple categories, and they're not really concerned with how the world's moving forward. They're obsessed with grievance history, and thus they're looking in the rearview mirror, they're not looking on the road, essentially. They don't see what's coming up. They have a very simplistic understanding, very well, I should say, a very dogmatic understanding of what's going on in the world today when it comes to class structure. And they kind of miss that right now that, there's this kind of modern oligarchy developing between big tech and media executives, finance, conglomerate directors, and, a very select cadre of like very upper level bureaucracy, state officials and things like this that's developing. So we have this oligarchical elite that's really kind of running things. It's not just sort of like, business owners or capital owners. It's the tip top. It's really the elite. But again, they're either kind of like going on these false dichotomies, or they're going on this woke tip, this SJW tip about kind of whiteness and capitalism. So they really fail to understand what's happening in the world today, but they're happy to kind of moralize about it and virtue signal. All right, the next thing is, so leftism, despite its devotion to science, fails to realize that particular drives and abilities are psychologically hardwired into humans, and specific humans, through a long process of evolutionary history. That is to say, common preferences and tendencies aren't merely social constructs, but rather aren't merely arbitrary social constructs, but are rather social constructs which developed out of evolutionary and social success over the course of many thousands of generations. This is the root of the notion that leftist politics fails to account for human nature. And everybody always says Marxism sounds great in theory, it doesn't work in practice, it doesn't account for human nature. This is why. They don't understand that social constructs aren't, like I said, arbitrary, but we have them for a reason, right? It was the people, our ancestors that survived are the ones that did the things that informed how we act and believe and our inclinations today. We wouldn't really expect, we would no more expect people to abandon their desire, for example, for social distinction and status than we would expect a lion to become a farmer. It's just not in their nature, right? We're very social creatures, and we're very in tune with status and hierarchy, and in terms of kind of invisible social hierarchies. So, and going back to evolutionary history, like the reason we have, there's so much here, but the reason hierarchies develop is because they enable complex societies, more or less, and complex societies conquer non-complex societies. So of course, because we live in a complex society that's conquered many other less complex societies, we tend to have hierarchies. And they're kind of everywhere in a sense, and I'll get back to that in a second. But leftists don't understand that, for example, gender dynamics evolved for a reason. Or they don't understand that even kind of like societal mores like religion, popular religions or popular spiritualities, popular moralities, developed for a functional reason, and it wasn't necessarily to perpetuate power, but rather it made those societies successful over the long run. And again, these things didn't just pop out of nowhere. They're not just kind of simple, arbitrary, quote unquote, social constructs, but rather they were very, very functional aspects to culture and society that allowed them to succeed. So again, leftists really don't understand the notion of adaptiveness, but it shows up in their life and whenever they try to do anything. I'll say that. Next one is number 7. Seventh point, talking point against leftism, is that leftists, despite their pretensions for original thinking and rebellion, are often parroting the vocal social values they're taught as children and youth. For example, fairness, equality, etc. And recently they've gained awareness and are upset by the fact that the world or the system doesn't live up to the ideals that it was told it should. So this goes back, this is Uncle Ted, right? This isn't me talking. This is old G Uncle Ted. He noted that leftists are over socialized, and they've kind of taken the rhetoric that they heard in third grade at face value, and now as they gain awareness, or as they grow up, they're starting to realize more about the world. They see that it's not perfect like they were told, and they're kind of pissed off about it. It's kind of like whenever you find out that your parents aren't perfect too, you kind of have a little bit of an ego crisis. So that's a lot of what's going on as well, is that, again, despite the original thinking or rebellion, it's really just kind of parroting a lot of the standard narrative, whether that's people are equal, human rights are, God-given, or human rights are the standard, this kind of universal natural standard. Any of these things, equality is good. Like I said, equality is good. So, yeah, it's kind of like this juvenile, fake rebellion, I should say, that a lot of leftists are going through. And that's kind of one of the reasons why, as young people grow up, they move more to the right, is because they kind of accept reality, as opposed to fighting against they accept the negative of the world, as opposed to tilting against a whirlwind, or tilting against a windmill and thinking that they're gonna change the system. But until they do, it makes them quite insufferable. So yeah, so they're often, like I said, parodying the dominant values of society, just pissed off that society doesn't live up to those ideals. Next one, number 8, is that far left ideology, because it's often a sublimation of resentment due to poor prospects for future status, rarely liberates or acts as a creative force. Rather, it is a spiritual and in practice a destructive force that seeks to negate those it sees as superior. In this matter, left-wing ideology acts as a slave morality which leads to expressions of cathartic vices or violence against oppressors. However, even following revolutions, the leftist utopia is never built. Okay, so this kind of goes into Nietzsche as well. Is that, again, far left ideology, it's really not so much for the people, but it's against the crackers, if that makes sense. It's not for black people, it's against the crackers. Or it's not for the workers, it's against the rich. So it's, again, kind of tamping people down as opposed to building people up. That's a very key distinction as well. But I'm gonna cut this part short because I'm not gonna like explain too much of Nietzsche, but it's an interesting aspect, and it kind of points out how, again, there's that resentment against people of success for their success, so they valorize the qualities of failure, and again, going into why leftism is maladaptive. That's part of it, because they're valorizing the qualities of failure and turning into vices the qualities of success. So, yeah. Next one is that number 9, Western leftism, at least Marxism, is a secular version of Christianity. They're both kind of slave moralities, like I just explained. Yeah, I have a whole video on this, but there's so many parallels. For example, original sin, heaven, a big other, things like this. So I advise you to check out that video. I'm not going to go into too much here because this one's getting kind of long already, but I have a whole video on this. So yeah, Western leftism is secular version of Christianity. Number 10 is that the leftist ideal isn't even that great. It's kind of a mud soup of equality, and it's not far from the globo homo ideal. The rightist ideal, on the other hand, is virtue as an adaptive and practical quality. This is a little bit more preaching to the choir, but I think it's important to reach out to the middle ground with this, is that what is the leftist ideal, and what does equality even signify, right? On a kind of cosmic level, the universe is inequality. It's distinction. It's empty space versus stars. It's empty space versus conglomerations of rocks, which hopefully life develops on through competition, through selective breeding, through natural selection and reproductive selection. What is a great society but one of beauty, one of complexity, one of expansion, one of innovation, not one of equality. In a way, equality is a public vice. And again, like you have globo homo, and what you have with that is you have a kind of plutarchic, oligarchic technocracy that is, again, that global elite, that oligarchy, the financial elite, and then all kind of, you have that on the top, but then underneath that, it's kind of this gray equality. It's the bug man. It's the corporate bug man in the pod. And I would argue that the leftist ideal isn't too far from that. If your whole thing is you want to erase distinction, if you want equality and equity, you want androgyny, you want to upend traditional mores, traditional distinctions, you want to go against hierarchy, you want to go against the notion of inequalities, natural inequalities, natural values through which status is ascertained. So what would that society even look like but a kind of gray, muddy, society without distinction? It's kind of lame, it's kind of fake, it's kind of gay. And again, The rightist ideal is one of practical virtue. It's ways you behave. It's behaviors. It's habits. So again, that's a little bit preaching to the choir, but I wanted to put that out there as well. Is that the leftist ideal is not even that great. It's like I said, they assume that if you have equality in a democratic workplace, that somehow makes things better, and it doesn't necessarily. Definitely doesn't make your society complex, and it doesn't make it able to resist your neighbors if they want to conquer you, right? Because that's part of adaptiveness. If you're in a internationally competitive environment, you need a society that, your morality doesn't matter if you're the slave to your neighbor. If you're subjugated under their system. You could have an ideal you want, but if somebody's imposing their ideal on you, then who cares? Same thing if you're dead. So that's something to consider. That the leftist ideal, it's not that great, it's maladaptive, but let's continue. The next one is number 11. Okay, sorry, I had to go re-up. Point number 11 is actually related to the last one. So leftists, the ideal isn't even that great. It's a mud soup equality. This is because, number 11, there's a failure to understand the positive role of hierarchy. So leftists have this idea that hierarchy, division, distinction is all very bad. But in reality, throughout our lives, we're encountered with various hierarchies. And negotiating those and eventually rising in them are part of what gives us in the moment a spirit of purpose and meaning, a sense of self-worth, accomplishment. So these are all very, very good things for individual psychologies. And leftists don't even really understand that. And I actually just put out a TikTok about that. So I'm not going to speak about that too much here, but it's on my TikTok. I think it's called Greed versus Status, and it's 3 parts. So yeah, check that out. Next one, number 12, is that far left experiments have been tried at different times and places in history. They often end up not as leftist utopias, but as stratified class-based societies with prominent market economies at the local and communal level, albeit one that's often regulated or bureaucratically managed by a strong state at the large-scale level, usually telecom industries and things like that. And these are places where due to contingency, maladaptive leftist ideology has been abandoned for what would be considered right-wing or conservative ideas and values by today's left, by today's Western left, that is to say. Today's leftists are not somehow better qualified or qualitatively better at understanding society. Instead, they are often naive youth without a fully developed prefrontal cortex. Okay, so I just kind of jotted that really quick. But so the basic point is that, we've had attempts at far left utopias. USSR, China, Cambodia, Vietnam. I typically don't mention, things like human rights abuses. I don't think that's a good way to argue against people on the left. I don't think it convinces a lot of people. So instead, I just point out that, how it ended up is kind of what I think society should be organized as. Here we have a mixed economy led by a government that, there is an oligarchy. There's always going to be a power structure. But this is, they're often corrupt and they're clinging on to power and everything. But they're not wasting time with charade elections. There's not public spectacles that are called elections, big media spectacles. They're not wasting time doing that. They, like I said, they tend to have these mixed economies that are regulated. It's kind of a dirigious state. They don't really support paused Western values. China bans BTS from TV because they say it's too gay. There's public drives to boost masculinity among the male population. In North Korea, they're not letting women dye their hair blue. That's not a thing in North Korea. So how these left-wing ideologies end up is essentially the kind of rightist socialism that people, at least on my corner sector of the political compass ascribe to. So really ours is more reality based, right? And again, it's not like these haven't been tried, but more importantly, it's not like today's leftists would do better. They're not more competent, they're not more qualified, they're not more intelligent, they're not better intended. It's not like Lenin, Stalin, Mao, and all these people. They didn't have good intentions. Everybody has good intentions. But reality exists. Sometimes you run into reality, and as well, power corrupts. People who are naive get pushed aside or killed. Strategies that fail, they don't come to power. And the people who do come to power have more pragmatic visions, oftentimes. So you end up with people like Fidel instead of Che running Cuba, or Deng Xiaoping instead of the Gang of Four and Lin Biao. Khrushchev instead of whoever else was probably aiming for his position. And you constantly see this kind of drift towards I don't want to say liberalization, because there definitely was a period of liberalization, but you see a drift towards the kind of again, that oligarchical society, which albeit not necessarily the rightist ideal, is a lot more in accordance with the kind of disdain for a kind of fake liberal charade democracy, paused fake human rights, those sorts of things. Kind of a fake morality. So you don't get that as much. That the biggest Marxist parties in the world think the Western left is fake and gay. It's important to remember. China, biggest communist party in the world, they don't like your pause bullshit. They don't subscribe to the tranny theory, the gender studies theory. It's not a thing there, right? If it is, it's definitely not supported by the state. Places like Laos and places like that, they have fairly conservative cultures. They're not 19-year-old women aren't getting busted through by the frat. It's not a thing. They're not to some degree. I mean, there's definitely an underground of sex work and things like that, but it's not like the West, where it's liberal feminism and sex positivity and body positivity and things of this nature. Oftentimes women get married very young, they have children, they do the housework. It's very traditional. So that's important to remember. And same thing in China, right? Like I said, China is building a society which does understand the positive role of hierarchy, which isn't the leftist utopia. It's not the classless, moneyless, stateless society. They have the market. People around China, they buy groceries with money on in a free market. Not necessarily. I mean, it's regulated just like the United States, but sometimes it's more poorly regulated. In fact, so that's just important to know, right? Leftist ideology, been tried, doesn't work. Today's leftists are delusional if they think they would somehow be better. Like I said, a lot of times they're children, effectively, in terms of their brain development. They're not fully developed in terms of their brains, and the prefrontal cortex doesn't fully develop until about 24 or 25. People younger than that aren't typically adept at making long-term forecasts and planning and things of that nature. People make pretty poor decisions before that. So yeah, there's that. Last one, number 13, is that, okay, so this one's kind of long in terms of what I gotta read, but it's essentially that egalitarianism can be tried, right? There's nothing to stop leftists from kind of testing out their ideals. And, I'm not going to say they should start a business, that's one of them. I mean, I often say this. I mean, a virtue untested isn't a virtue at all, right? If you want to open borders, leave your doors open at night. You let the homeless person camp out in your backyard or sleep on your couch. I mean, you're for compassion, do it. Nothing's stopping you. Yeah, it's not going to change on a society-wide level, but, What are you going to do? Force other people? Are you going to externalize the problem to other people instead of you dealing with it? And I know you'll be like, we'll build social housing, but that social housing has to be somewhere. Can we build it in your backyard? No? Okay, why not? So the same thing. And again, like starting a business is a capital intensive sort of thing that most people can't do just to test out their theory. On the other hand, here is this. So number 13, the egalitarian experiment and the egalitarian, okay. It's a bit of a stretch to ask leftists to open a collectively ran business to test their theories of social organization and production. But here's another more plausible social experiment. Get 4 to 5, maybe more, consenting people of the same cohort together, i.e. a group of friends who are leftists. Either agree to take a long trip or live together for 7 to 8 weeks. Pull a sufficient sum of money to cover the entirety of the expenses, or at least, a part of it, maybe pull enough for the first three weeks. So pull that together into a collective fund, decide how it's going to be managed, who's going to hold on to it, and all of those things. So you can pull this money together equally, everybody contributes equally. You can do it according to how much resources they actually have, proportionate to the others, so that people with higher incomes would contribute more. Or you could decide how each person contributes based on an intersectionality oppression point system, right? If somebody's like a black male, they contribute a little bit less. If they're a transgender black female with Tourette syndrome, then they barely have to contribute at all. If you're a white male with blue eyes and all of that, 2 parents, then you're footing the bill more or less. You're paying a disproportionate amount. Okay, so do that, and then deduct. Okay, so after you do that, you have this collective fund. You've all contributed to it. Now what you're going to do is you're going to use that collective fund to pay for all normal expenses, traveling, living costs from anyone in the group. So you have the collective fund that you've all contributed to. Now that's what's going to pay for everything that anybody does in the group. Of course, this will naturally create various pressures and tensions. Because each person contributed to the fund, there will be a specific tension whereby any extra expense by another person is seen as a deduction from one's own access to a limited social resource. Thus, in order to not feel cheated, individuals will increase their consumption to match in expense that of others, thus leading to waste and excess consumption. On the other hand, they will try to reduce the amount they contribute to the fund on any future basis to passively protest what they see as another's careless spending. Since all living, spending, and non-free cost non-free activities are paid for from a collective zero. Okay, so all living and spending costs are part of a collective zero-sum financial fund. And so expenses can become sources of debate because everything is coming from a central fund and it's a zero-sum game. Anybody who spends one thing, it comes from the resources of another. Any spending, all expenses become sources of debate and unnecessary tension. So it just essentially complicates things. And especially those who have little extra cash to fall back on outside of this collective fund, after it runs out, they'll develop a resentment of the waste that is incurred by those who are less worried about the fund's quick depletion and who can always contribute more to it. Usually that's if they divide it equally. But if the fund is maintained in proportion to the means or status of each member, an ill spirit will be created between those who contribute, an ill spirit towards those who contribute less but spend more will be fostered. So essentially anybody who had to contribute more based on their oppression points, I suppose, or just because they have more money to contribute according to their ability, they will develop, foster a kind of resentment towards those who contributed less but spend, more or equally. Let's see. So it will become apparent after a short while. If you try this, I encourage you to. If you're a leftist, you can prove me wrong, but it will become apparent, in my opinion, that after a while it makes more sense over the long run to operate through private individual funds, not collective ones. Essentially, it makes more sense to do what people already do, because why else would they do it? We kind of have society because it makes sense. We behave in a way because it makes sense. It's adaptive, like I said. So trying this kind of collective, social democratic financial scheme, it naturally creates tensions. It's easier just to do it the normal way, private funds. You can kind of discuss what you want to do. People can kind of spend their own money. They don't have to worry about the zero-sum game going on, the extra tension. So leftists could easily try this right now, and it would be a great opportunity to prove to themselves that their own spirit of democratic solidarity has efficacy. So that's it. That is the 13 talking points against the far left. I'll recap that one more time. Number 1 was leftist morality is fake and shallow. Leftists often have poor or even predatory characters. Number 2, leftists are political hypocrites who gladly rally behind moneyed power to silence political opponents, and also are often on the vanguard of the increasing monetization of normal everyday activities and expenses. Number 3, leftist ideology is personally maladaptive and stunting to those who embrace it. I think I didn't mention this before, but there's actually a correlation between attractiveness and politics. And conservatives are typically more attractive than liberals. Of course, this is a mainstream study, so they're not going to study the far left and the far right, but it's an interesting thing to note. Right-wing thought is part of attractiveness, like I said. So left-wing ideology is personally maladaptive and it's stunting. It makes your life worse. You don't want that. Number 4, leftist ideology is socially maladaptive, and it's an exacerbating system of a corrupted culture. So I mentioned this before, that leftist ideology is part of the degradation of a society on the world scale. The United States doesn't have a future, essentially, because it's embraced, as long as it's embraced this kind of far left ideology where left is right and right is left, and distinction doesn't matter, and we're all gonna pretend like trans women are women, and all this kind of bullshit. The United States doesn't have a future, specifically because there's other people who don't embrace that bullshit. Like I said, China. They don't. Even though they tried the leftist route, now they're what would have been described by the leftists in 1968 in China as social fascists. The right-wing socialists have come to power in China. They gave up the leftist fantasies, pursued a policy of national greatness. So that's essentially what I argue. A kind of right-wing socialism that engenders personal and societal greatness, adaptive behavior, virtues. Moving on. Number 5, far left ideologies are simplistic and misinterpretive frames for understanding the world today. They often think in terms of oppositional categories rather than emerging trends, i.e. being versus becoming. All right, so I'm pretty esoteric there. But far left ideologies simply get it wrong on so many things because they're dogmatic. They're parroting Marx or Lenin or whatever. I don't know, Malcolm X or something. I don't know. They're parroting people. There's not a lot of original thinking going on, and because of that, their analysis isn't really that useful. Right? Workers, capitalists, okay, that, the old lady who owns the fucking restaurant isn't part of the ruling class, right? The guy who works at fucking Facebook has stock options and everything, has a lot more power in the world than at least if he's a technocrat and not too low on the scale. He has a lot more power than the average small business owner. And of course, there are the elite, which are the true rulers, so to speak. And again, this is the financial elite: banks, hedge funds, big tech, media, state actors, these sorts of things. So the left gets that wrong too. They're not even good at what they try to do, really. It's not even that critical of the actual world. It's critical of an image of the world that doesn't correspond to reality necessarily. I mean, it's like a pale reflection, right? It's got the general scope of things, but it's like a dirty mirror, I guess would be the phrase for it. And this, what I am bringing to you now, is actually the Windex, and I've wiped the mirror of socialism. And what do you know? It's right wing. You see the right wing future. So let's continue. Number 6 was far leftists reject science by adopting a blank slate theory, which believes that social constructs are arbitrary and merely instruments of power, rather than what they are: biopsychological features arising through a long evolution in socially and naturally competitive environments. Okay, yeah. So we already talked about that, right? There is human nature, there is biological nature, right? All organisms, all animals, even probably down lower, want a few things, right? They want to maximize pleasure, minimize pain, and conserve energy. And people are the same. They have higher needs, of course, but far leftists simply don't understand this. They think that everything's just kind of a mirage, just something just arbitrarily created, right, for no reason, other than just people were bad and they decided oppression should happen. They decided hierarchy should happen, so it was just created by bad people, and now we have it. And, it's just so simplistic and retarded. Going back to my other last point. So yeah, they don't really understand that these quote unquote social constructs actually arose out of evolution. They had very adaptive qualities to them that helped us survive, or at least helped some of us survive. The social constructs we have are the social constructs of the winners of history, of nature. If a branch of evolution adopted terrible behaviors that caused it to be wiped out, either by nature or by other competitive things, then we wouldn't have those mores today. So yeah, leftists don't understand that either. It's really silly. Number 7, leftists aren't even original or rebellious. They're just mad they're just mad what they taught as children isn't true. And this goes into the over socialization, the Ted pilled. Yeah, I'm gonna leave it at that. We already talked about that. Number 8, far leftist ideology can lead to something that's resentful and destructive, but really creative. Number 9, far leftist ideology is secular Christianity in the modern world, and both are Western slave moralities. Number 10, the far leftist ideal isn't even that great. It's a mud society of bugmen, not much different from the trajectory of globo homo. And of course, you kind of have to know a little bit of the lingo to know what the fuck I mean there, but I'm going to continue. 11, leftists fail to see the positive aspect of hierarchy and competition, mostly because they themselves are losers, but that's neither here nor there. And number 12, far left ideologies have been tried throughout history, especially in the revolutions during the 20th century. It's not that those ideologies didn't work, it's just that they eventually arrived at something far different and far more pragmatic than the far left political and economic program. This isn't a moral judgment. But on the other hand, the notion that today's far leftists would somehow do better, even though they're naive and inexperienced and otherwise mentally and physically deficient. It's kind of silly to think that they would somehow be better intended, better qualified, and more capable, and so substantively do better. And the last one is number 13. The obvious impracticality of leftist ideology can be tried and tested and demonstrated on a personal level. I mean, I gave that example. I gave the test. You don't have to let the homeless person sleep on your couch. You don't have to start the collective marijuana factory, whatever your leftist democrats business aspirations are. You can simply get together with a few of your leftist friends, pool resources for all expenses, and then see the tensions that develop from that, to simply see how that fantasy of democratic mutualism, it quickly breaks down in the real world. Like I said, it's all this sounds good in theory, it breaks down in practice. This is a good example of this. So there's that, and that's all of it. It's like I said, these are all points that probably won't convince a lot of leftists if they're far into it. Like I said, ideas have people don't have ideas, but I do think some of these notions, especially in the first few, are directed towards more demoralizing them, noting how leftism isn't good for them. The reality is these people already have personality issues. They already have social anxiety, social problems, life problems. So this is an area that really kind of is personal for them, and it's real, right? Like the notion that leftists are uglier. It's true. And a lot of, maybe they don't care about that, but that's fine. But it might resonate with somebody who's on the fence. So these aren't necessarily meant to sway the leftists as much as meant to demoralize them, as well as sour public opinion against them. And they're a little bit different than I said, the normal gay Ben Shapiro, Crowder, louder with Crowder. I'm a normie dickhead Crowder. But yeah, so there's that. And let me know what you think. If you have any other ideas of how the best rhetorical ways to go after far left ideology within the zeitgeist, within the discourse, to try to capture some of their momentum, take the wind out of their sails, move the Overton window more towards our side. I do think we're gonna win this in some respects, simply because as this critical race theory kind of bullshit leftist utopia ideology becomes more popularized and more sold as a slave morality to people, the new generation, the generation after this one, is going to think like, people tend to rebel, right? Like, as well. And they're going to look at this generation with its faggot morality, and they're going to see that it's shallow as fuck and it's lame, right? They're not going to think it's cool like this generation does. In fact, they're probably going to think it's kind of lame. They're going to probably have very nasty things to say about this generation. What is it? Generation Alpha, I suppose, after the Zoomers, or maybe the younger Generation Alpha. I do think they'll completely reject many aspects of leftist ideology, but we need to capture some of that energy and direct it into kind of rightist ideology. That way we don't just end up with globo homo, right? We don't want that. So this was the Talking Points series. And I might make another one of these about libertarian philosophy, because I think that's the other thing that's holding right-wing ideology back, is this fucking kind of LARPy, gay, I'm a capitalist, I'm a libertarian, really it's I'm autistic, some of it, where I'm just disconnected from normal people, sort of thing. And again, that one comes from a good place too, right? Like, just like the kind of far left comes from originally starts at a place of altruism in a lot of ways, and to some degree a place of loserness, wanting to escape the hierarchy, so to speak. But libertarianism as well. It comes from that desire for freedom, that desire for space to roam, the desire to have the chance to rise up hierarchy. So it comes from a good place, but again, it's not equipped to address the unique problems today arising from technology. So I'm gonna maybe do that in the next episode. We'll see. If you have any comments about this one, please let me know. Obviously, I have a special interest in the left. I think it's very fake, very gay. That's GHEY. Don't censor me, YouTube. And I will catch you next time. Yeah, subscribe and share this, right? That's I please do that, because I don't even live in the West, right? So I get killed in the algorithm on every single social media. If I post, my shit does not organically come up, for the most part, in the West. Unless you have subscribed, unless you are following me, or unless I somehow trigger someone, then I don't get the exposure that I could get if I was living in whatever, the shithole that is the United States. So my bad, but if you are, and if you care about this, I greatly encourage you to help me spread this. Right? I think this is important info. I think it's definitely useful. I try to make, especially this, I think this is a better way to argue. These points are better points to bring up than fucking ECP, right? I mean, just commenting that, if you don't understand it, especially. Yeah. And yeah, in any case, I hope you like it. Leave a comment below. Let me know what you think. Peace.